And hello and welcome everyone. As Julie said, I'm Nora Reynolds with the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, and we support a range of different learning activities and resources for community organizations and educational institutions dedicated to advancing critical, ethical, and aspirationally decolonial community-based learning and research. So just over a year ago, when global education became virtual global education, program decisions impacted communities around the world, particularly among organizations that have built their program models from community-driven and community-based principles. The move to virtual presented significant questions regarding whether to move forward and how. So today we are joined by three folks that have been longtime collaborators, both personally and with the collaborative as a network. Brandon Blache-Cohen, Executive Director of Amizade, Jess Evert, Executive Director of Child Family Health International, and Willy Oppenheim, Founder and Co-Director of Omprakash. They are here to share how they and the organizations with whom they work responded to these new challenges and questions. How do we respond? How do we move forward? How do we ensure the focus on ethics and equity continues, or maybe even is enhanced and improved? So we are also joined by Eric Hartman, co-founder of the collaborative and executive director of the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship at Haverford College, who will pose some questions to our guests after brief introductory comments from each of them. So today we had about 45 total registrants. About a third are already institutional, organizational, or individual members of the collaborative, and about 2/3 have been engaging with and following the collaborative work for some time or are brand new to the community and here to learn. So welcome in particular to those of you who may just be learning about the collaborative. We're excited that you're here with us today. So just to get comfortable with using the chat and to see who is in the room and where our energy is, why don't we all drop just a very brief introduction into the chat so we could go with work, location, and one thing that is maybe keeping you up at night related to virtual global education. So very, very brief. I might say something just like collaborative, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA. And access. Who gets to participate? Is virtual actually improving access? So I'm just going to give about a full minute or two to drop these intros in and to read who's in the room with us here today. So go ahead and introduce yourselves, please. Great, thank you, and keep them coming. We'll continue to kind of learn about who's here with us today. I'm now going to turn it over to Brandon to get us started, but please, as a reminder, keep the energy going in the chat, whether it's affirmations, questions for later, complimentary information, or additional ideas. We'll moderate from there as well. So Brandon, take it away.
Thank you, Nora. Appreciate the invite. Thank you to everybody involved, Eric, Willy, the other, Julie, the other folks who will be a part of this panel. I can't see everyone, but if I could get just a couple of thumbs up. Does anyone speak Pittsburghese in this forum other than me? Yeah, we got one or two there. So for those of you who are not familiar with the language of Pittsburghese. It actually is its own kind of like dialect here in the United States. We have a word that it's innate, is that what we say? And it kind of means like there's a lot of interconnected things in your routine. So you might, if I were to say, hey, I'm going down to the grocery store, Nat, what that means is I probably have other errands to run. So I'm going to go to the grocery store. I might check out a few other places. I might do a few other things on the way. And I might come back with more than just groceries. Everybody here would understand what that means. When I was invited to be a part of this conversation, there's a lot in there, you know, ethics, equity, online global learning, fair trade learning, virtually. I think one of the big lessons learned for us in the last year has just been there's like a lot of a gnat. There's just, it's like everything that's in this title and then everything else is kind of connected to it. And, you know, it's not just that we're going to the virtual store here for global learning. Suddenly we're discovering all sorts of other things along the way. So there's your lesson for Pittsburghese for the day. Yeah, as Nora said, my name is Brandon. I'm the executive director of Amizade. In case you're not familiar, Amizade is a nonprofit organization based in Pittsburgh, although none of our staff live in Pittsburgh anymore. We're scattered all over the world these days. And, you know, basically we do three things as an organization. One, we try to bring people together in a room who would otherwise never be in that room. Two, we try to break bread and inspire empathy and civic engagement as best as we can. And then three, we try to kickstart some social action together. And that means that we don't only work with students. I know that this forum is mostly people who work with university, maybe a few high school student populations, but really our mission doesn't tie us to that. We can work with just about anybody and everybody. Hang on one second, why did that not switch slides? There we go. So a year ago, this week or last week, right around a year ago, I had to write some horrible emails. You know, the world was kind of a really scary place, and we had to figure out what we were going to do as an organization. You know, we operate in northern Italy, so we kind of had an appetizer to quarantines and things like that. And it was really clear, though, because we work in so many vulnerable spaces, no matter what our education partners wanted to do, we needed to put a halt to all travel indefinitely, actually. And even as of today, we don't quite have an exact travel reopening schedule, although we're hoping to try to pilot some things in the fall. But for us, you know, our staff, we in our organization's history, we're community development folks before we're study abroad. You know, so our mission has nothing to do with study abroad. Our mission, you know, most of our staff doesn't come from a global education or an education abroad background. We come from, you know, community and international development backgrounds. And of course, a year ago, we didn't know what was about to take place. We didn't know the extent to which it's going to affect our work, our daily lives, our friendships, our connection with the world. And, you know, of course, it's been a very difficult year. In that year, though, a year ago today, if you would have told me what would have come about from virtual global engagement, I would have never believed you. If there's a takeaway that I want everyone to understand is that from a access and equity perspective, I think that this has opened up something that could have spent a lifetime working to achieve. Suddenly our work is almost universally accessible, whether you're living in a community in rural Bolivia or you're at an elite American college, you can pretty much have access to the world in a similar way. And there's a lot of solidarity with that. So much so that the feedback in our programming has really opened up in pretty powerful ways recently, getting all sorts of emails and data sets from people and in ways that I didn't expect virtual to be able to meet. This is from one of our education partners in New Mexico that's talking about some of our programming with at-risk immigrant youth. These are actually middle schoolers we've been working with in New Mexico. And so the idea that the stigma around virtual learning has been lifted. I mean, even me, I was a resistor to it. And not only has it been lifted, but it potentially could be scalable. Potentially what we're doing suddenly could go from being a luxury for kind of like the elite few who want to gallivant around the world to being something that can impact and change the DNA of people all over the world. So here's what we did. In April and June, we did whatever we could. We were throwing darts just to add value to our mission. Our community partners, we weren't sure. Should we go into a cave and hide? Should we, how should we handle this? And basically, we decided to just try some things. I created a talk show. That was funny. We made a cookbook. That didn't work out. We had a speaker series. There was some value there. We raised some money for our friends around the world and shared out a series of solidarity segments. A lot of folks, we were able to get a PPP loan as an organization, but a lot of our partners had no access in the governments that managed their communities to get state funding. We created a COVID-19 misinformation virtual service learning curriculum. We were all troubled by all the misinformation going on. And so we designed a little toolkit for basically anyone who wanted to grab it to quickly in the summertime use it with their students. Then in the summer, we started to try to dabble with some actual social action. We created some digital advocacy projects. We did a lot of surveying and benchmarking with our community partners. And then we got down to brass tacks as we got closer to the fall, and we virtualized everything we did. We really tried to mimic what an on-the-ground experience looks like in the communities that we collaborate with our partners, but in a digital space. We created a whole bunch of multi-country themed based VSL conversations. So one of the things that virtual did was it opened up that we didn't have to be siloed in one place at one time, but we could feel solidarity from someone's basement in Virginia and someone's basement in Jamaica. Well, they don't have basements in Jamaica. Someone's second story in Jamaica and someone's house in Italy. And some of those conversations around anti-racism, climate change, anti-radicalization become more and more relevant as we go on. Really began to blur the lines of host and visitor. We just got some funding we're really jazzed about. We're going to be able to offer all the same programs that, again, elite institutions in the United States have access to. Digitally, we can do the exact same thing in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Puerto Rico, in Jamaica. And that's what we're going to be spending a lot of time doing. And of course, linking a lot of folks who never otherwise would have access to travel this year. Again, a year ago today, if you would have told me we'd be working with more students than ever before, I would have never believed you. And then this has been really powerful and important for us. We're able to reimagine global education entirely. This pandemic has just cleaned out a lot of the old ways, or at least we hope it has. And so the opportunity to do good is magnificent. We have a little virtual recipe. This is not a joke, but we've discovered, or we've tinkered now for a year. It's still, we're trying to make it better. But basically in our virtual programs, we're trying to do compelling story, a little bit of nerd stuff. Sometimes faculty members are confused where they fit in this. It's a good place for you to fit in, bring in the data and why that data matters. And then for us, it's really important that we have action. So there's a lot of reflective interactive group activity, a lot of concrete things that everybody can do about whatever we're talking about or learning about, and resource sharing. Now, I will say, and I'll talk about this in a moment, as you get into the way this recipe breaks down in the virtual space, one of the drawbacks has been some folks in our communities have been left out of this. And I think as our menu of recipes evolve, that's something we're going to be looking to do. So as I said, there's a lot of innats, and one of the biggest innat that surprised us along our journey to the virtual grocery store is just how powerful this has been so far with student behavioral data. Now, we've been asking the exact same questions for a long time of students in post-program surveys. I never could have imagined that a virtual learning experience could be comparable to travel. And that's exactly what we've seen. And in fact, in some cases, and these are not small data sets, there's like hundreds of students that we've worked with that are filling out these surveys. If you compare 2019 in-person travel and 2020 VSL, you're gonna see in some cases, the numbers are actually higher in virtual. increasing feelings of empathy and well-being for others. What? I would have never guessed that. We have 3/4 of people saying that they're going to engage in activities that will make the world a more equitable place. 94% of students are saying that they've got a new appreciation for the challenges, assets, and possibilities present in the community they connected with virtually. That is some important things that, again, we picked up along the way, and that means that everything we do in the future is going to have a major part of it being in the cloud. Okay, so how does this relate to fair trade learning and ethical considerations? I'm gonna give you the smiley faces first that we've learned so far. And the first is that it's obviously way better for the planet Earth. I mean, if you're in this field and you haven't thought like, oh, am I contributing a little, you know, like yes, the answer is yes. For years, we've been like putting people on planes, sometimes not, you know, entirely necessarily, in a swoop. You know, our carbon footprint this year for Amizade was the goose egg. It was totally zero. That's good, and that's a part of fair trade learning that we never actually were able to address in fairness. Secondly, access. I mean, this is actually available to nearly all people everywhere. And if we're not developing and designing experiences that are blurring who's the host and the visitor right now, I don't know what we're doing, because it's so much easier than ever before. Recruitment and theory of change. We don't understand this, and there's a lot of people in this call who are very smart. And so if anyone wants to research this, you got an open invitation. We do not know what happened to the white savior complex amongst our students. Everybody's talking about this. Our community partners are curious. You know, the faculty that we're working with. A lot of the language that we fought against, or we spent time trying to teach young people that, like, hey, you're not going to solve poverty in a week in Trinidad. We don't have to do that. And we think that there's something going on where, you know, you're in mom and dad's basement and like you're meeting with someone who maybe typically you'd have this power dynamic over, but the students aren't coming at this with the fact that they have the answers. And so we're saving a lot of time and effort in not having to like break them down a little bit in this way. So it's been really interesting and impressive at the same time. 4, clarity of commitment. There's reason to believe that some of the social action projects have actually potentially have been more impactful. So some of the things that we're doing, including digital advocacy, including surveying and benchmarking for and with community NGOs that we work with, as of now, almost all of the feedback from community partners has been that this has been surprisingly more helpful than anything students ever do on the ground. It's done with more humility, it's done with more patience, it's done asynchronously. It's not as like, they're not taking up too much of like some busy executive director's time. And it's being done in a way that might be a little bit more sustainable. So moving forward, even when we have students on the ground, a lot of their projects probably will be in the cloud. Okay, here's where we've seen
you're probably at the final minute. This is the nudge to say timing. Yeah.
So
okay, great.
Thanks, Eric. So we've run into limbo and tech issues that have met some leaders losing access. That's a real issue that we need to be clear about. There's just like less people involved. The money squeeze is very difficult. There's less money to go around, which means that the leakage rate in communities ends up being less dispersed. Less people have are touching these experiences than would in a travel program. Learning integration. Sometimes we feel like a cheap date for universities. Honestly, like we've been told that we're like the coffee budget, you know, for like grad students, and they'll try it out, and then we're filling the void of like faculty to faculty time. And then here's what we need: more stories, more practice in doing this, more money, and more data in understanding this. So again, if you're someone who is interested in anything I just said, please reach out. We'd love for you to study this stuff. We're also reimagining global education. We're creating something called Campus Anywhere. I'll be sharing this out soon, which is to rethink, a reset on especially study abroad in semester programming. A lot more flexible, nimble, community-based, not university-based universities always, in which students are largely taking online courses and then basically working inside of communities and off of campuses. So here's the concrete takeaways. The pandemic has changed the rules, and I believe for the better of global education. It's comparable with outcomes for students and as travel programs. That's huge, and we can't underestimate that. It's better for the environment. It's better for equity and access. It's better for normalizing and scaling our work. we don't have to be a luxury anymore. Suddenly and hopefully we can be embedded in school systems and school districts around the world, and not necessarily just something that a lot of rich kids at elite institutions have access to. All right, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. My name's Willy Oppenheim. And I live in Seattle, Washington, and I help to lead an organization called Omprakash. So for the next few minutes, I want to tell you a bit about Omprakash, but also, yeah, similar to Brandon, talk about some of the larger trends that we've observed, which I think are way bigger than any one organization. So I want to start actually by telling a little story. And Nora heard me tell this story last week, so sorry, Nora, but I think this will be new to everyone else. And the story to me really gets at some of the thorny issues that are really at heart of these questions around ethical partnerships across differences, and fair trade learning and so on. I also want to just say from the outset, I'm going to really try to focus my comments here specifically around the nature of partnerships in our network, what those partnerships look like, what kind of work students do with our partners, and how the learning component also happens. So I think these are all things that we can kind of brush over and say, oh yeah, we have these partners and students do like service projects with them. But actually, from my perspective, like the how is really, really important here. And that was true before the pandemic and is certainly true now. So here's my story, and then, yeah, then I'll back up and tell you more about Omprakash. But some of you might be aware that a few years ago, there was a pretty significant merger in this space, and several different autonomous organizations in the kind of like global learning, service learning industry merged into one. And the CEO of that one big organization, which was called Impact Global Education, was explaining to me in a casual kind of over a beer type of conversation. He said, yeah, you know, what I realized is that this sector, the kind of education abroad, volunteer abroad sector, really has this occupancy problem because it takes a lot to set up these programs and run these programs and have these partnerships. But if you are at, let's say, 50% occupancy all the time, it's really hard to make money or even to break even. And so we, by creating this merger, are sort of solving the occupancy problem because we can have one volunteer hostel in a given town, let's say, and these different, you know, sub businesses of ours can be feeding students to that town, but they can all stay together. So it's basically was like a business scheme to increase occupancy. Now, it turns out that they got lots of, you know, private funding and investors and so on, but because of the nature of that business model and the fact that it was totally like travel dependent, they folded during the pandemic. And as kind of a footnote on the story, but significant, particularly as we think about ethics, I have friends who worked for them that never got paid and that were in Vietnam when the pandemic started, and their community partners in Vietnam were saying, hey, do you happen to know when we're going to get paid? Because we were told we would, and we never saw the money and so on. So, so that didn't work out. But to me, the bigger point and the reason I'm kind of fascinated by this story is that I actually think the occupancy problem is a problem in a whole different sense. And so this person was sort of explaining it as, you know, it's a business problem that is related to kind of like meeting your bottom line, satisfying your investors, and we can solve it by pooling resources essentially. But I actually view this occupancy problem as the one of, if not the biggest problems at the heart of any debate around ethical exchange. And essentially, from my view, which is quite different than the person who was telling me about this problem, the occupancy problem is problematic precisely because it creates an incentive for the host organization and or the kind of middleman placement organization that's selling the experience. It creates a very clear incentive for them to fill those seats, to fill those beds. And that's true whether we're talking about a travel program where there's occupancy in you've got the overhead costs of your hotel rooms and the you know, there's a certain number of positions on the ground that you need to fill. And it can also be true in a virtual kind of program where you have a certain amount of overhead and you're saying, all right, we need to figure out the best way to, you know, enroll as many students as possible. And so what I've sort of been observing and thinking about for a number of years here is how that basic dynamic and essentially that business model of selling service experiences, whether we call it service or community engagement or internships or, you know, there's many shades of gray here and I'm not conflating them all, but broadly speaking, we're talking about modes of facilitating meaningful engagements across differences. And I think as long as there's this incentive to, you know, boost your occupancy and get more and more people on board, it can create some really strange dynamics. And so that's kind of like the prompt I would put out to everyone here, whether you work at a university or you work for a education, you know, global learning type of organization. I would invite you to consider, like, how are we caught up in our own occupancy problem, if at all? Like, how are you under financial pressures to fill those seats, and how might those pressures be in tension with some of your aspirations for more ethical, decolonial modes of global learning? And we could probably have a long conversation about that, and I'd love to know your thoughts. But that's kind of something I've been thinking about, and those types of questions have driven my work for a while. So with that as a broad introduction, hopefully not too abstract, I'd love to tell you a little bit about Omprakash. So Omprakash is a global network and a US-based nonprofit that, broadly speaking, does two things. The first is we have a network of partner organizations. These are about 200 organizations in 50 countries around the world. And our partners use our platform to do a number of different things. One is recruit volunteers and interns, but that's not all. They also use the platform as a fundraising platform. They can access grant resources through us. They connect with each other. We offer conferences and capacity building programs. We have an internal grant program for partners and a few other things like that. So the first thing to know about Omprakash is it's a global network, sort of almost an ecosystem of, again, 200 organizations doing work from health, education, environment, entrepreneurship, human rights, gender-based advocacy, kind of across the board. The second major thing we do, which is distinct from the partner network, but connected to it, is we run our own customizable and fairly robust online learning platform, which is called Edge. And we first created Edge about 8 years ago, specifically to provide pre-departure training to people who were preparing to volunteer abroad, precisely to combat the sort of white savior mentalities that Brandon was referencing, and to help students grapple more with some of the ethical complexities of trying to help others or do good when crossing differences of culture and power. And what started as a pre-departure training platform for international volunteers has quickly evolved into, we now offer all kinds of different Edge online learning programs. Some are supporting local community engagement in the United States. Some are supporting our partners around the world who are doing their own programs. There's many other variations of it. But so the big picture is, for years, since before the pandemic, Omprakash has had this network of partners and the online learning platform. And we kind of figure out different ways to work with different universities and with nonprofits and with others to offer those two resources together. And the main comment that I want to offer now regarding kind of how we think about fair trade learning and ethics, and as it has translated to the virtual space, is that it's crucial to understand that before the pandemic, for the last 15 years, it is not possible to buy a international volunteer or service experience through Omprakash. The dominant model of sort of placements, where someone might contact me and say, oh, do you have any placements in Peru? Or, oh, how much does it cost to get placed with this partner in Kenya? Or for that matter, in Philadelphia. That doesn't really compute for us, because the way it works is each of our partners has the power and autonomy to go on our site and create specific positions for which they are recruiting. And that could be someone to help with an English class, or it could be someone to help with a marketing plan or help with their social media. We have students right now helping an organization submit a patent application. It could be a research project, so it's kind of across the board. But the partners define the positions and then individuals apply. And that individual could be a college student, or it could be a retired person. It could be someone in the so-called global south or the global north. We have plenty of examples of both. But anyone in the world is welcome to go to our website, browse our partners, and apply to work with them. And when they do so, it is entirely up to the partners to decide whether or not to accept that person and invite them to work with them. If they do, we then have all kinds of other resources that we provide to support that engagement, including there's a sort of like goals manager where the partner can define specific tasks for them to complete and so on. But the initial creation of the position and the application and the vetting and the accepting, all of that happens centered on the partner's autonomy. And to us, that is fundamental to our understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about ethical engagement and ethical exchange. And that is kind of how we get around the occupancy problem, because we're not trying to sell. We've never made money by selling trips or selling experiences in that way. And so if a student contacts us and says, hey, I really want to work with this organization, we can say to them in good faith, great, go ahead and apply. And it's up to them. And that's kind of how the world works. We can't guarantee a placement or a position for everyone. And on the flip side, if a partner comes to us and says, hey, we're really looking for students to do this kind of thing, we can say, great, go ahead and post the position and hopefully you'll find someone. But we can't just say, oh, cool, we've got this new program at this university, we'll just send them to you. So all of that was true before the pandemic, and we have more time to get into the more details of how all this has translated to the online space. But the point is that our partners, when the pandemic started creating online positions, which some had already done, but now they've really started to do more. And since the pandemic began, I think partners have created about 180 different online positions. Some are 5 hours a week, some are full-time, and anyone can apply. And there's all kinds of complexity that I'd love to get into in more detail, but I wanted to share that broad introduction as a way of saying the way that we kind of grapple with a lot of the ethics here are thinking, how do we allow people and organizations to connect in a non-commodified environment in which someone can say, hey, I'm looking to make a connection, and someone else can say, cool, that sounds good. And we are not caught up in trying to sort of fill seats and sell programs. There's much more to say, but I'll leave it at that. And thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, Willy. And we will pass to Jess.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Nora and Eric. Thank you, Brandon and Willy, for your comments. I'm Dr. Jessica Evert, Executive Director of Child Family Health International. And it's been really helpful to hear my colleagues speak. I wanted to kind of focus in on some of the pivots that we've made as a global health, service learning, experiential education organization. So CFHI is based in the Bay Area, and we are approaching our 30th birthday in providing global health experiential education in 12 countries. And so, a lot of the themes and upsides that have already been mentioned, I think, are our experience as well, but I want to hone in on a few of them. So CFHI did pivot at the beginning of the pandemic to all virtual programs, and we still have suspension of our place-based programs. And so one of the things with CFHI is we work across kind of the higher education spectrum from undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, and about 50% of our scholars are undergraduates and 50% are in medical school, public health school, nursing, or residents and postgrads. And so well, I think that was an interesting challenge, because with virtual, you really have to segment in many ways by the educational level. So we have virtual internships, practicums, electives, and then custom programs for schools that want to engage with us in a particular niche. So that is exciting because we got to create a lot of new ways of doing this, but I think also can be difficult because the learners really do need very different types of content and are at different levels in terms of their competency in global health. And so there's a lot that goes into making sure that it's the right content for the right level of student in the right time frame. Again, because when you have graduate students who only have a month-long electives, and then you have some professional schools such as nursing who can just do a few days, it really creates a lot of opportunity and sometimes challenges in terms of compressing or expanding programming. Some of the pros, which you have heard, but I just want to further emphasize, is that we have been able to include learners, a much more diverse set of learners in our program. So for example, for our global health elective, which is for final year medical students, allied health, and advanced practitioner students, we have 3 LMIC learners for every 1 HIC learner. And those students have all been offered full ride scholarships, which is really exciting because in the same classroom, you know, we have learners from Lebanon and from Costa Rica and from the US and from Ghana and Uganda. And particularly for our local partners who are really leading our virtual programming, you know, it's super exciting for them to be like, we've never had learners from so many different places engage with our community-based organization. And so I think that's bringing a lot of richness to the programming. At the same time, I think that brings an organic nature to the virtual space. And, you know, some students, particularly from high-income countries, really want kind of uber academic, you know, research-oriented content. And they don't always see that value of the cultural exchange, particularly when they're at higher professional school levels. And so I think as curators of these environments and these learning experiences, part of it is how do you curate experiences that emphasize the relevancy of cross-cultural exchange and diverse perspectives. So we have to do that in a really intentional way, so some students don't kind of mentally check out of the conversation. We've also been able to decentralize our program leadership and content creation. We have regional leads for virtual instead of most of it being housed in our US office in terms of logistics and pre-program preparation. And then we have a train the trainer model, really equipping our community-based partners with working in the virtual environments and on all the platforms that are required. We have really strong evidence for our impact. So both thank you to the GES data that the collaborative is leading on, as well as data that we're collecting internally and external research that we're involved in a variety of ways. The virtual programs are showing amazing impacts that are all statistically significant, super exciting. So I don't think there's a question of the impacts, but I do think sometimes the impacts are different, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And then I think that in global health, experiential education, service learning, we have long struggled with volunteerism and students playing doctor or nurse on patients in low resource settings, patients who often don't have the power and privilege to question who students are and who's doing what to them. And so in that way, the virtual environment has allowed a abrupt stop to poorly designed programs, and hopefully CFHI wasn't instigating those, but there is still a lot of white saviorism even on the best programs, and was really able to orient to appropriate and safe global health competencies, which CFHI has done a lot of the research in that area, so that is exciting to see. In terms of, I don't want to say they're cons, but in terms of red flags or things that I want people to think about, is that when you are doing this type of work in health-related sectors, there is a temptation, or schools will request clinical interactions like telehealth. And so the risks of volunteerism are not gone. And so CFHI has had to be very kind of create appropriate boundaries around what type of interactions the students will have. We're using case-based clinical, not real-time clinical interactions. And the voyeurism is real with virtual, right? If you're trying to do clinical or other high risk or vulnerable population contact. And so really thinking about how that voyeurism weighs in on our ethical principles and the way we work through these programs. In addition, I want to emphasize that I think a lot of the cultural norms of the virtual space are really more aligned with cultures that are direct, that are task oriented, tend to be more Western in nature. You know, you get on at a certain time, it lasts a certain amount of time, you focus on this, and then you finish. We don't, you know, unless we do this intentionally, we're not having tea. We're not necessarily taking time to build relationships. So again, I think schools and students need to value that we have to create some informal virtual interactions that are more relationship and indirect communication oriented, or else we are really driving these programs with a Western cultural mindset. We also, I think, have lost some of the what I call moments in between, which when students are in country, there's a lot of moments in between that are some of the most powerful moments, the most influential. They develop the student in terms of their intra and interpersonal skills such as patience, adaptability, flexibility, empathy. And so in losing those moments in between, we have to think about some of the limitations of virtual and then how to create some of the moments in between in a virtual space. I will also say that virtual is challenging because of time zones. A lot of our partners are in Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, and we really are having to hold things at times that are extremely inconvenient for partners. We still try to modify, do things earlier in the day in the US timeframes, but the reality is that like these programs are often driven by the schedules of students and universities. And because students aren't physically in country, that means everyone's getting online at times that are not convenient for a lot of our partners, for community members, et cetera. I think another thing is that, and I'm trying to kind of grapple with how we handle this, but when there's constructive feedback about programs, I think there's a little less empathy for the partners and less sense of connection. So students will go kind of straight to their school with complaints or other things that normally partners are really adept at working through and modifying programming. And students just don't feel sometimes that heartfelt connection with the partners. And I think that's really hard because people are working really hard on pivoting. And I don't see, some students are not necessarily giving grace around, you know, different aspects, like people when they can't get on Zoom or when the internet's out in Uganda or this or that. And so again, we have to orient students to that, but I also think that they develop a little more grace when they're living alongside the partners and experiencing the community and seeing what people are up against, rather than just seeing that the internet's down and they can't get on for a session. And then I just want to re-emphasize the financial viability question. You know, none of us are doing this for money or making a lot of money at this, but we do have to keep the doors open, the lights on. We have been able to reduce our US side staffing considerably, which has been great. I realized that in reflection that our US-based staffing in some ways was really catering to the university's risk management and risk mitigation concerns, and and the need for kind of a very Western-centric conversation when those concerns are happening. And so virtual is a lot less risky, and so we don't have to necessarily have that bandwidth in the US office, but we still have to have some bandwidth, and the costs of websites and insurances and all the kind of things that we still need, and nonprofit best practices in terms of financial management and bookkeeping and things are still there. So I think the question is, because the price point's different, you need a lot more students. How are organizations going to survive in this new reality? And when we try to relaunch place-based learning, you again have to have some of that bandwidth to manage student incidents. And so how are we going to do that, particularly as there's a ramping up time where volumes in country are lower? So I'm just being fairly candid that I think the financial viability question has to be looked at, because really good organizations still have some overhead. So thank you for that. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you all. It's really wonderful to hear from each of you today. And it reminds me what brings us all together, this effort variously construed to really recognize community-based living knowledge and wisdom, and the ways in which it's too often marginalized, and make sure that it's recognized, remunerated, amplified, and hopefully more people from many different positionalities all around the world are learning more often through these kinds of programs. So thanks for being here. It also is a reminder that, your different entities work with quite different populations, and we're hearing some of that possibly in some of your comments, which actually is keeping myself in check, because I'm looking for the lessons, and of course they're distributed differently across different populations and systems. That said, we framed this as a conversation on fair trade learning, which you all touched on definitely. I just wanted to kind of review back through to set up two questions. These sort of core themes of being community driven, which is coming through in the ways in which this moment can create spaces for hearing from more situated, applied, and practice knowledges around the world. Capital conscious, which is certainly appreciate the points around economic access that are emerging here. I'm really curious, and it'll be my first question, like where the pain points are as we think about these shifting economies, because so much of fair trade learning has been about trying to watch the investments and making sure that the structure of economics follows the ethical aspirations. And we're just refiguring around all that now. So that the caring is credible is the third C in that alliterative memory tool we put together a few years ago on fair trade learning. And that meant that none of this white saviorist voluntourism is happening, that we're not seeing orphanage tourism, that we're not seeing medical voluntourism with, in entirely uncredentialed ways. So we're all happy that that's off the table right now, right? And just kind of a reminder that that's the kind of thing people are referring to in the chat that we want to see does not restart. And I'm so fearful that, we've got so much work to do if that's actually not going to restart to work on the hegemonic narratives all around it. But fourth, continuously connecting, and that's actually where I think the other action is. And continuously connecting has always meant within fair trade learning, and these principles are out there and they're many and diffuse, but continuously connecting brings together this idea that we're not engaged in one class, we're not engaged in one program, we're not engaged in one transformative moment. We never want to do a program where a student says, it changed my life. Sorry, now I'm mimicking my 18-year-old self. It changed my life. And doesn't actually shift behaviors, commitments, work, lived embodied values in how we go forward. So that question that Kate Abney dropped in the chat that combined whether intercultural competence is a legitimate framing in the context of structural inequities and centuries of systemic violence really calls my attention toward this, I guess, opportunity I heard across some of your different comments, where the virtual space allows for connectivity in ways where people might have opportunities to learn from one another. More people learning from one another in what Brandon's experiencing as a flatter way, perhaps, than in the past, although that wasn't necessarily repeated across the different presentations. So in any case, continuously connecting remains this effort, and I'm not sure if I finished the thought about what that means for fair trade learning. It's not a moment, it's a journey. And what we're working to do here is not to give people one great experience, but to set up a process of building polyvocal, diverse, inclusive, just, sustainable communities, right? And trying to nudge forward the different intersections with that from wherever we are. So starting with the capital conscious piece, and I think differently among your different approaches, and Willy's emphasis on occupancy frames a particular one intersection with that well. There's a kind of intentionality around economics. Jess ended with saying there's a kind of a new pinch point coming around sustainability. If you think of who the community members are, like it used to be the host communities, but now it's sort of the community that's being visited in some way virtually. Who the educators are, and I think Brandon shouted out like that there's some swimming in between university and NGO staff there. Or community members. and the students' access, right? What pinch points do you see coming up in new ways, and how do you see the sector dealing with that? And Jess, you look ready, so maybe if you start, we go backwards.
So is this, sorry, just to clarify the question, in terms of the financial readiness or the cross-cultural? I heard two themes, cross-culturalism.
Right, so I do want to
cultural.
ask about so that I'm just setting up the second question for later, but the financial is for now. Yep.
Okay. All right. I get excited and I go down one line of thinking and then I'm swiveling over. So in terms of financial viability, honestly, like, I think we can get through this year continuing at a loss. I think it really depends on two things, where organizations were going into this. And then secondly, to Willy's point, like if you were trying, there are many large organizations where people who really don't care about transformative education or humanism or cultural competency or decolonialism or anything are running huge volunteerism organizations, and they're doing it for financial gain for a lot of different players, I think, and maybe doing it for other reasons too, but that is a main driver. So I think if your main driver was financial, you may be pursuing a different sector right now, because those type of people are gonna be like, oh, actually, I'm going to move into the mask business or the COVID instant test business or, whatever, plexiglass, all the things that are, the rage right now. So I'm hoping that there maybe will be a clearing of this area of work of some of those folks. Now, I think they will pop back up, right? They will pop back up when things can ramp. So we are in a delicate period because there's going to be there's going to need to be a runway to relaunching place-based, and if you're doing it thoughtfully, that launching will be slow. And then I think many of us are probably committed. I mean, at least CFHI is committed to virtual for the long term as well. And so many of those companies that are doing it for financial gain, they need to have, they're going to need to restart up in a year or two, or maybe longer, depending on travel. And so I think we're going to have a moment when those companies try to restart and relaunch. Like, are we going to have enough momentum amongst universities, amongst students, amongst the popular culture to have people really question those opportunities and not take advantage of them? And I don't know if we're there yet. That's what the collaborative needs to do in the next year. And we're happy to help. But I think, looking at like what is going to be financially viable in a year, and how can we influence the consumerism in this realm. And I feel like in global health, we're definitely making traction over the last decade, and potentially it's going to be a little more difficult for some bad players or people who have, dreams of building huge empires of volunteerism. Maybe it'll be a little more difficult for them to relaunch, and that might be, a good thing.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, lots of different pieces to this question. So as I've mentioned before, the basic model with Omprakash is that, like, if someone wants to browse our website right now and apply to work with one of our partners, whether that's online or in person, we have done the legwork in vetting the partners, and that's a whole ongoing thing that I could talk more about. It's not just a one-time vetting, but it's sort of the ongoing maintenance and support of this network. But we are really intentionally not involved in that like matching or placement process. And so we don't get paid, and accordingly, the partners don't get paid. Now, in some cases, they might say there's a suggested donation or a required donation, and we don't really interfere with that either. It's a gray area. But when it starts to feel like, I think the only reason that this partner is like posting this position or recruiting these people is because they see it as a source of revenue for their organization, that starts to be a concern for us. Now,
right, Willy, could I ask? I want to so that's super clear. Thinking about the ways in which, beyond that moment of volunteer placement, we're in a sector that's so disrupted right now, the whole sector. So whole colleges are closing like every month, right? So the sort of like, I think a lot of the campus community engagement discourse sort of got started in the sense that there are resources in campuses and there aren't elsewhere. Well, that's not true either. And I'm wondering about how this work, which I see as good work, civil society connecting, sustaining work across your different models that are represented here and across what a lot of people on the call do. It's good work. The question is really about how does the work sustain? So I think, and I don't know Omprakash's model, but some combination of grants and selling bits of knowledge in the EDGE curriculum, or something towards sustaining a model. You've been really clear that it's an ethical commitment in your organization to make the placements component free. But how do we as a community continue forward? Is embedded in the question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, I was starting to get to that. Thank you. But so the point I was going to make is that there's sort of a larger holistic picture here, which is that, as I mentioned, we also provide a fundraising platform and it's a tax deductible fiscal sponsorship for our partners around the world. And actually in 2020, our partners raised more than any prior year in the last 15 years. Maybe that's because I actually don't know how that maps onto like global trends in philanthropy, but I think a lot of the people who are big donors to this kind of thing weren't particularly affected by COVID and continued giving. And I think a lot of people also recognize the need. And so one way that students get involved, which I also have mixed feelings about, but students might say, I'm going to help this partner run a fundraising campaign or an advocacy campaign through Omprakash and share that with my friends and family, and they might donate. And so in that sense, it's not lost on me that the partner is still getting some financial return from hosting students, but it's sort of less transactional. It's more of a longer term thing. Another point, something that we're doing this spring with University of Ottawa and University of Illinois and some others is we so the core curriculum and learning material that we offer is largely asynchronous. So we don't necessarily have to grapple with some of the time zone issues that Jess mentioned, but we are offering sort of guest lecture type of things where our partners will join a live call and be part of a lecture that's one component of a course. It's not like the backbone of the course, but it's sort of value added, and we get paid out of the university budgets for that. Now, where does that come from in the university? Sorry to clarify, when I say we get paid, the partners get paid. Like we're just kind of a pass through for that. But so is that taking the job away from a TA, or is that draining already limited resources in higher ed? Like quite possibly, but I guess the larger point that I'm trying to illustrate is that by sort of demonetizing the placements per se, that doesn't mean that we're naive to the deeply unequal distribution of resources around the world and the many ways that we can try to play a part in some kind of redistribution. So that happens through these university engagements. It happens through fundraising. I'd also like to think that there's so much wastage and so many budgets that were previously going towards paying for seats on planes or seats in hotels or whatever it would be, that there are resources that now maybe those budgets have been slashed completely, but our experience so far has been that we're able to say to people, hey, you're not sending any students abroad this year. So that means like you actually maybe do have a little more breathing room in your budget, and let's think about the creative things we can do with that. So maybe that still feels like a short-term, short-sighted kind of answer, but that's my take, is that even in sort of very lean times in higher ed, there is still money to pay for students' community engagement and global learning, whether that's online or otherwise. And the question then becomes, how can we use that money in a way that is equitable and fair and doesn't just incentivize us to be like selling more and more seats?
I really appreciate Willy's use of the framework of occupancy, thinking about this as like having an occupancy problem, because I totally agree. And I look at other educational platforms and other things that society has deemed essential. They don't have to be profitable. No one right now is out there on the street saying math needs to be profitable or we can't do math in schools. And I think that's where the disconnect is here, because similarly as Jess's organization, the pinch is real. The pinch is real for all of our community partners, even if they have state-supported money. But we have a real opportunity right now in this pandemic to show the world that we can be as essential as math, that we can inspire young people to take the next step in life, to be better, empathetic neighbors. There was a question, a couple of questions about decolonializing education in general, and I look at the marketplace, and there is a marketplace, Willy, on the other side of this. We have to admit, we have an occupancy problem, but part of the problem is we have a marketplace in this, and that's not going to go away no matter what model we try to do until we can normalize what we do and embed it into education more so, where it doesn't have to be profitable. We don't have to sustain ourselves because it's a guaranteed measure of a local school board budget or something like that. And I think we actually can get there right now. That's what's so exciting about the pandemic. Like, we can show at least some of our local communities that we should be inside of schools, that we should be next to some of these other elective type experiences that have been out there for years, music and arts, and we can be part of the norm of education. So that's where I'd like to see. I mean, I think it's a bit of a fantasy, but not too far out. And we have some models around the world. People who have heard me speak before, I talk a lot about Northern Ireland. They have started to normalize this type of work, which erases some of the marketplace, because, of course, there's still a marketplace within schools, and there's still private schools, and there's still other options. But generally speaking, we are finding ways to pay math teachers, okay, in which math teachers don't have to have, all these weird equations in order to be able to fulfill their daily lives.
Yeah, I appreciate just how imaginative it could get here. And I do want to transition to the other question that's kind of in the docket around intercultural praxis or cultural humility or cultural competence, depending who's talking, and whether we're seeing better, as Brandon was framing, or I think Kate Abney's question suggested maybe not better, maybe actually worse, kind of dynamics going in the virtual space, and what we might do about that, what it might mean. To just comment on the last section for a second, there's just so much there, and I think it's interesting to see some of Jess's chat around how I would characterize what's she's expressing there as distributing much of the work globally, because it is, after all, a global network, and having the funds follow the labor makes great sense. This is kind of a stretch because I'm trying to imagine what it means, but I've been so impressed with some of the work that's bidirectional and multi-directional. I know Amizade had moments over the years where someone from Ghana, Bolivia, Peru, Northern Ireland's working together on a project in West Virginia or Washington, D.C. So I don't think this necessarily means working ourselves out of jobs, but maybe my role is really about helping people understand rural Pennsylvania and not anything more than that, right? It's just kind of situated where we are, where our strengths are, and our positionalities in different ways. But in any case, and I see there's some chat since I've been talking, wondered if you three would like to jump in, and also invite Kate, maybe, if you'd like to unmute and share a little bit about what you're grappling with.
Yeah, so I guess, a lot of this, many of these observations come from my continual frustration in the lack of imagination and kind of this container of cultural obsession that seems to be very prevalent in this country. We use culture to describe so many things, and yet in this reiterative utilitarian sense of culture, it really does nothing. It doesn't describe much. It's a generic label, which might need to be discarded. And the most recent, I guess, frustration I had was attending this IES workshop the other day. And I asked a very simple question, which was then sort of classified as deep. And that scares me when people say that I have deep questions, because they're not my questions. They're questions that have been asked by people that don't look like me, who've been subjected to racial tyranny since white people have been around, right? And so my question was, in what ways are we avoiding engaging with race, racialization, and issues in and around colonization through this tool, through this survey? And I've asked these questions before, and the response was, well, this survey tool does not address that. That is what a confirmation bias survey tool is for. And I think for me, that was the perfect answer, because it made me then question any number of other things, or it actually confirmed all the other questions that I had previously. And so I really get, and I'm the Associate Director of Intercultural and Global Learning. And when people are like, oh, that's such a fantastic title, I'm like, it's a terrible title. I didn't create it. I don't know what intercultural means. I speak multiple languages. English is probably my worst one. But when we're talking about intercultural, and we're talking about competency, and we're talking about dialogue, I often find that this type of cultural learning, it obfuscates what are very real racialized practices that impact upon people's lived experiences, their narratives, their subjectivities. And I'm not willing to relinquish that idea for a score of 8 for my hardiness dimension, or I need to work on my resilience dimension because I only have a score of 2, and my world orientation is a score of 5. So that's kind of where that comes from. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it makes boatloads of sense, and judging from the nodding I'm seeing across the screens as well. I wonder who among you might want to tie that to what's happening in the virtual world, if you can.
I could.
Go on.
No, go ahead. Well, no, I wanted to actually ask Kate for her input on this perspective, because so I'm a family physician. I practice in the hospital and I do end-of-life care. And so since CFHI has gone virtual, we have cross-cultural effectiveness and adaptability training, but that's paired with health disparities and racially based and other, health disparities. There's a variety of different identities that experience disparities, and racism and racial identities is one of them, but there's others, which I'm sure you all know about. But so for students who are pursuing health professions fields, and for me as a practicing physician, this feels very real. Like cross-culturalism is very real, and racism is very real, and how it affects interactions in one-on-one and group and small groups and clinical settings, and then how that ties to larger health metrics and disparities is very real. And so when I actually give a lot of that content for our virtual programs, and and medicine is working through this in its own right, in terms of that we call race-based medicine, which is it's very outdated and is actually biologicizes race and does all the things that lead to disparities. And then race-conscious medicine is what we're working towards, which really is the recognition of racism, of structural violence, and other aspects. And so that all comes to head in our virtual programs very tangibly. And so I wonder if maybe I'm living in maybe if I'm not being as in touch with things as I should be, but it seems very real to me in teaching that.
So that's a beautiful articulation of everything that I have absolutely no problem with. And I probably should have premised my comments by saying that I'm a medical anthropologist. I've taught global health, infectious disease, you name it, for I don't know how many years, I'm very old. And so I think that there is a place specifically within biomedicine for this exact type of work. But how that translates to the type of work that we're discussing here, I think because of neoliberalization, because we have big corporations in the pockets of our board of trustees, our presidents, our committees, whether you're an R1 institution, whether you are a land grant, depending on all of these different metrics of excellence and academic academic distinguishing matrix, I think there is a very real hesitancy to engage with these things based on who is sitting in those boardrooms. And I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that equity has to show up everywhere, right? And so I would actually say, Jessica, I'm not saying you have a pass, but that is where I see racialization of medicine and racialized practices in medicine. I think there's a huge place for that there, especially when we're training soon to be or future physicians. And that's where I've seen it work most effectively and most efficiently. But in terms of international higher ed, in terms of our types of programs, service learning, all of these kind of other peripheral, and they have been treated very peripheral. I don't see that it has really been operationalized to a very effective point.
So many of you might be familiar with the Global Education Task Force that we tried to create in Pennsylvania, and it was a catastrophic failure in that we never could get it voted in. It's just a task force, comes with no money. Most of the language involved in the task force had to do with cultural competency, and that's what we were trying to sell it on to middle of Pennsylvania right-wing conservatives, saying, hey, look, you know, your niece is in France studying abroad right now. Maybe you should support at least looking into this thing called global education. Anyway, it didn't pass, never even got voted on. And that was many years of many people on this call's lives to fail that way. And one of the lessons that I learned in that process was that some of these indicators that we've tried to create for the neoliberal way of thinking are just absurd to begin with. I mean, half of Congress would be considered culturally competent, and I would not want any of those people to be my next door neighbor. So I don't know what the point is of trying to quantify or create those types of tools that aren't moving forward, you know, our communities in any sort of powerful or profound way. But the other thing I'll say as it relates to the politics of this, because I think maybe you didn't mean to add, or maybe that's just where my brain goes, to the politics of this. And about 4 or 5 years ago, there were state legislators all over the country that started to regulate what we do, especially if they even bordered on any sort of anti-racism curriculum. Okay, so we saw the state of Arizona try to ban the white, what is it called? It's slipping my mind, but there were attempts to ban curricula that were anti-racism. Those have continued for the last few years. But Betsy DeVos funded think tank even created this like massive paper about how civic education is liberal brainwashing, is essentially what it was being called. So one of the challenges that we have, you know, to respond to your question here, is that we're operating in this like really big complex country where people hate us. They hate what we're trying to do, and the cooler stuff that we do, the cooler ways we try to transform this generation, especially the younger generation, into digital and global citizenship. The more we get attacked for it, the more we even get banned from being able to do it. So there's a real uphill battle in trying to reach out to a lot of the folks in this country who are easily radicalized or easily misinformed or easily you know, bought and paid for as well. And you know, I that's why I look at how this links to virtualization right now, is that there's a real opportunity to just get on people's computer screens in any kind of way right now, in a way that there never was before. Like I just say one other thing and then pass it over to Willy, and that is that we collect political data on our students, how they claim to fall on the political spectrum. I had never looked at it ever. And the day after the 2016 election, I looked at it, and lo and behold, only 2% of our students were conservative or very conservative. And that was curious to me because 33% of our students self-identify as being from a rural community. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is going on here? We've completely failed. Like, how are we not reaching out to more diverse populations politically? So we ended up creating and writing a grant to bring different groups of young people together, and they had to, one group had to identify as being conservative or very conservative and white and rural. The other group had to identify as being liberal or very liberal and Black and urban. Okay, and it was a very simple experiment, a service learning experiment, where they would learn about each other's communities, have a home stay for one night in each family, and then all go to Washington, D.C. together on a trip. We got it funded, and it was, I mean, talk about a failure. We couldn't get anyone to sign up for this in rural communities. We reached out to gun clubs, to Boy Scout troops. We left high schools eventually because it was deemed too controversial. So all this is to say is that, like, one of the things that I see as potentially opportunistic here is that virtual might be able to bring folks together in a way that maybe we were jumping into the swimming pool too much, too quickly for a lot of people who were considering us way too radical from the onset.
Wow, this is really, I love this conversation. And I want to go back to some of what Kate has invited us to think with in terms of the concept of culture itself and its limitations, as when we talk in the sort of common discourse of like learn about other cultures, or I've come to understand their culture, I don't know their culture, and there's this kind of essentializing quality to that narrative and a sort of othering dynamic to it. And of course, among anthropologists, that recognition and the sort of existential crisis that followed in the whole postmodern turn happened 30 years ago, and it continues to happen. But I would like to think that one of the take home or best outcomes of that has been a sort of turning the lens inward, and a recognition that any discussion of culture is necessarily as much about the lens we are looking through as it is about that which we are looking at. And that, thinking about culture, thinking about difference, thinking about global learning, whether online or otherwise, through this lens really does implicate all of us. It invites all of us to get beyond the sort of, global learning means looking at people over there and cultures over there, and hopefully, we can understand them. And I've got my checklist on like how to, be culturally appropriate in such and such context. And I think we're in a moment now where we can really push beyond that and start to say, when we have these encounters across difference, it's as much the things that surprise us or unsettle us or keep us up at night are an invitation for us to delve deeper into our own biases and our own social, political, economic, and yes, cultural embeddedness in a particular context. And so I don't want to have any kind of like triumphalist tone here, because I think that work is very, very hard. And I don't think, whether online or in person, I think it's always easier, particularly maybe for younger students or just for people who haven't thought about this a lot. It's always easier to assume that your lens is normative and the others are sort of exotic. But I have found some really interesting examples of, in the past year, through the pandemic, through virtual engagement, where students are being pushed to look around and question their own context, their own realities that much more rigorously. And one of the ways that we really push for this through our online learning platform is with the work of digital storytelling. So every student, it varies by program, but generally students will create a digital portfolio comprised of a certain number of posts. And you can imagine in a context where someone's traveling, it's like, I arrived, look at all these exotic things. I can walk down the street and take photos, and I can interview someone in another language. And that's all really cool. But what's been really cool in the last year is to see people doing that in their home context, and taking some of the same questions of, I'm doing some online internship with an organization in South Africa. We're talking about disabilities, but I can't go to South Africa. So I'm now going to be interviewing people or making field notes or doing whatever as I walk around in Seattle and think about disabilities in this context. And so I do think there's a real invitation here to be moving beyond the kind of essentializing concept of cultural others and towards cultural difference as something we can, through which we better know ourselves.
Okay, there's so much going on here at once, trying to chat and listen and think about the fact there's 5 minutes left on the clock. Thank you all for this really moment of remembering why we gather. Appreciate you. Kate, my chat was about the framings. I'm sure you're familiar with cultural humility coming out of health and social work. And I think the emphasis that puts on recognizing positionality and intending to make people accountable for the way in which their positionality might call them to reform structures. That's interested me in how I've tried to work on framing with students. And Amr Ahmed, I don't know if you've come across him, framing intercultural praxis, but he speaks about the way in which I'm going to try to paraphrase him now, but intercultural competence comes out of a international education moment a couple of generations ago, where it was quite more often almost even a finishing school for white women going to Europe and understanding the ways in which appropriate behavior could help them navigate, whereas diversity, equity, inclusion comes out of social justice and a particular rootedness in like the 1960s in the United States and confronting systemic exclusion. And he and others are trying to work to bring that those things into conversation through intercultural praxis. And something that in the collaborative we're trying to work on with them. In fact, we're hoping to have a conversation with Amr for collaborative members in about a month and a half, I think. That actually also, I think, ties to Willy. I appreciate what you're saying about the narratives locally for students, learners, I should say. I think we're just beginning to get to the tip of the iceberg of starting to get sophisticated around understanding what it might mean to be a global thinker locally. I think that's something that's been a popular idea in ed abroad and civic engagement for more than a decade. But we're just starting to really grapple with what's it mean to be part of ecologies and historic systemic exclusion and how that calls people into reimagining the stories that they retell and the places that they're part of. So I guess that gives me a little hope that I see more opening and more action in that area. And actually, since we just have about 3 minutes left, I did want to ask the panelists today, before we log off, first of all, huge thank you once again. But if you have like one sentence or a couple sentences on a hope you have from the virtual moment, and we could close with that.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Nora. Thanks, team. Yeah, I'll just say that I think virtual gives us the opportunity to collide more. And, you know, we can have all the localized knowledge we want, but when we have people living in such small silos all the time, all over the place, whether, you know, it's where my in-laws live in the suburbs who there's not an African-American student in the class, or, you know, whether it's where my kids go, which is a very different space, suddenly in a virtual space, we can collide with people who are different than us. And that to me is a revolutionary start if we're able to do that, to make that happen. I see a lot of opportunity with virtual. I think we can normalize what we do. I think we can create models that are scalable, that aren't based on selling programs and you know, can disrupt the marketplace, but it involves us becoming no longer a luxury, but more of a part of the education system in the United States.
I can go next. So I think the two words I would have is overwhelm and aspiration. I think there's a lot of aspiration and a lot of opportunity for all the good things that Brandon mentioned. I also think it's a very dynamic period and has been for a while. And some of this can be overwhelming, and there's a certain paralysis that I think universities have been in, students, partners, organizations, by virtue of the pandemic and how it's affected all our lives. So I think giving grace to one another, hoping that the optimism prevails, and also just having patience as we work through our overwhelm at times. So thanks for having me.
In the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of narrative around like, oh, it's, you know, the great equalizer. It affects everyone equally. And of course, we know that's not true. And there's all kinds of pre-existing inequalities that are just exacerbated now. But I do think there's a very real sense in which everyone has been affected. And that does open some new pathways for empathy and for vulnerability. And the kind of the easiest example I can think of for that is just that, you know, if someone says, sorry, I've got stuff going on right now in my family, why should that ever be controversial, you know? But I think in the last year, no matter what the context is, there's all of a sudden a little bit more willingness to be like, oh, I get it, you know, do what you got to do. So to me, that's a beautiful thing. It's been born out of some ugly circumstances, but a little bit more willingness to recognize, oh yeah, we are all tender-hearted, vulnerable humans working our way through the darkness here. To me, that's a beautiful thing to be recognizing. So thanks, everyone.
A strong note to close on. Thank you all. Go well, and we'll see you again. Thank you.